Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
You're in studio on Super Tuesday, Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington as we add the voice of Jennifer Nassour, the aforementioned Republican strategist and former chairwoman of the Massachusetts Republican Party, back with us here on the program. Last time we spoke, Jen, was on New Hampshire primary eve, and there was still a feel that Nikki Haley could make a dent here going into South Carolina and into Super Tuesday. Is it fair to call this the last stand for Nikki Haley? How are you looking at her chances tonight if Vermont is the state we're focused on?
I don't think, coming from Massachusetts, I'm feeling like Vermont's not the state that we're focused on. However, she did get the endorsement of the governor of Vermont. She did get the endorsement of Susan Collins in Maine. And in Massachusetts, we have 64% of our electorate are actually unenrolled voters. And we see that both parties, Republican and Democratic parties, have lost voters in the last year, which I think speaks volumes about where both parties have been going and the messaging from the super far right MAGA and from the super far left progressives. And so I think she's going to have a great night here. I think in Virginia, you see what happened in D.C., that, you know, most of the people who work in D.C. live in Virginia. So I think there's a carryover there. So I think that Nikki's going to do really well tonight. And it's far from over. I mean, listen, anyone can do math. If you do math, the magic number is 1,215. And Donald Trump is only at 240. There's a long way to go there. And so tonight, there are 874 delegates up for takes. And so we'll see how she fares tonight. But she's not going anywhere. She was here this weekend in Massachusetts. We had over 1,000 people at a rally for her. We had a fundraiser for her, raised a ton of money. Donors are coming. New faces are coming out. People are energized. From Massachusetts, she went from North Carolina to Massachusetts to Vermont and to Maine. The woman has done almost 8,600 miles in 10 days. I don't think Donald Trump has done 8,600 miles in the last 8 years.
No, I know, yet he continues to dominate in the polls, and he's going to steamroll through states like Texas and California tonight. I appreciate your passion, and it's contagious, Jen, but, you know, we had Chris Sununu on with us last night talking about a closing window. The path could get a lot more difficult after tonight, right? How do you see that continuing through the next couple of weeks?
So, look, anyone who's run for office before or been involved in a campaign, you know that you need two things. You need the volunteers and you need the donors, because those are the two things that actually make the campaign continue to move. And so as long as the volunteers aren't going anywhere, and I can tell you, people will follow Nikki anywhere she goes. That's number one. And number two, those donors, like I said, I had a full room of new faces on Saturday night. I think that is something that, you cannot replicate. And at the end of the day, Trump, listen, 70% of the country doesn't want another Biden-Trump showdown. 60% believe both Biden and Trump are too old to be in office. And 40% of voters continuously say that they do not want Donald Trump to be the nominee of the Republican Party. And that's not 40% of a general electorate. That's 40% of Republican voters.
Sure. That's the curse of this primary season for Republicans like you, though. If the whole country were like Massachusetts, we'd be having maybe a more deliberate conversation here. But he's 30 and 40 points ahead in the polls that seem to count here. So is this another kind of momentum play? You see her making a dent tonight and then going to a state like Florida. I'm just trying to figure out how you get through the primary against Donald Trump. You can make the case that she's a better candidate against Joe Biden, but this is a tough time now, isn't it?
Well, I think Republican primary voters need to wake up, quite frankly. Listen, at the end of the day, you can win a playoff, but are you going to win the championship? And the answer is no. With Donald Trump, Fox News poll came out the other day. He was 2 to 3 points ahead of Joe Biden. That is within the margin of error. That is, any bad news story will sink that campaign. Whereas Nikki Haley is 8 to 18 points, depending on the poll. And that is exactly where she has continued to be this entire time. So if you do not want another Joe Biden administration. If you do not want a Kamala Harris administration, then you need to vote for Nikki Haley, because you have an opportunity to actually put someone on the ballot that you want right now. In November, you have no choice. You have a choice between the two people who have been selected for you.
This is why I know you love hearing conversations about no labels and third parties. If we end up with Donald Trump and Joe Biden, anything could happen there, knowing, to your point, that polls suggest that voters want an alternative here. We're spending time with Jennifer Nassour, the former Massachusetts Republican Party chair, Republican strategist. Talk to us about issues while you're here, Jen, because it's obviously driving decisions this evening. In New Hampshire, we were talking about immigration in a state not typically associated with our southwest border, maybe the Canadian border. But we've also added abortion since Joe Biden was elected because of Roe v. Wade. You've spoken passionately about the impact it had on the midterms and other races since then. And then, of course, the economy. What are voters carrying into the booth tonight, or is it not a monolith? Is it different issues in different states?
I think it's the same issues. It's just how they're focused and how they're tailored, right? So I know here in Massachusetts, we're a sanctuary state, unfortunately. And here's what happened. All the migrants came to Massachusetts so that way they could find housing and whatever line they were pitched by the administration. They came here, and now they're kicking out our senior citizens and our veterans from their housing. They kicked out children from a rec center in one of the most difficult neighborhoods in the city of Boston. So kids were displaced in the middle of winter without any place to go, thrown out on the street where there's gang violence, there's drugs. It was unbelievable to house 200 to 300 migrants. They took over a hotel in one of the suburbs and then to house migrants. And then they opened up a restaurant that had been shuttered as a catering facility. That is all on the backs of the taxpayers. And so I think the immigration issue is an issue for everyone, but it's how it affects everyone. In Massachusetts, the most important issue is always the economy, but that immigration issue is absolutely affecting our bottom line here. The abortion issue is going to continue to be, and if Republicans don't wake up and adopt Nikki Haley's view and platform on abortion, we are a dead party. Because at the end of the day, women will always care about this issue. It is always going to be a big issue. May not be the number one issue, but it will always continue to be an issue. We need to have real conversations with women around the country about what can realistically happen and our own views and how that affects policy and how government should stay out of your bedroom.
Jen, I've got less than a minute. Does Nikki Haley need to win something tonight to keep going in this race?
She just needs to win delegates. As long as she keeps delegates away from Donald Trump, she stays in the race.
There you have it. Jennifer Nassour, it's good to see you again. Republican strategist, former chair of the Republican Party in Massachusetts, with the view from the Northeast, where a lot of us are going to be looking tonight to see the performance of Nikki Haley here on this Super Tuesday. I'm glad you're with us.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It's going to be a long evening, Joe, of course, because it will actually be well into tomorrow Eastern time when the last polls close in Alaska. But we kind of have a sense, we think, of how ultimately this is going to end, which essentially is the general election contest for all intents and purposes beginning after.
That's right. We kind of said that coming out of New Hampshire, and this has been seen as a bit anticlimactic, but the math will be impossible to ignore. It appears after tonight, Kailey, if the polls are correct and Donald Trump has the commanding lead that he currently enjoys on paper, to your point earlier, it'll be mathematically impossible for Nikki Haley to pull this off. So the question is, why would you keep going? And we'll help to answer that together, I guess, over the coming days.
Yeah, of course, we have the consideration that financially she very well could. She's still pulling in millions of dollars from donors, but will people still be willing to throw good money at her if she has no real clear path to the nomination? Would donors continue if it's just in case money, essentially.
Yeah,
if it's just a question of whether or not Trump is ultimately going to be able to serve as the nominee, depending on what happens in his myriad legal cases.
Well, that's true. And after we heard from the Supreme Court on the issue of immunity, there might not be a just-in-case strategy for her. Let's bring in Gregory Cordy now, Bloomberg News politics reporter who's been steeped in all things campaign since long before the voting started. Happy Super Tuesday, sir. Is it the feeling super to you, or is this coronation?
It's feeling like anticlimactic Tuesday. Okay. And you know, the Super Tuesdays have come in all different kinds of flavors over the years, right? Sometimes they're a little earlier, sometimes they're a little later, sometimes they're competitive on one side but not the other. This one seems especially like we have front-loaded a lot of the primaries where we know the outcome of this. But we have one candidate, Nikki Haley, who is committed to playing out the string at least through Super Tuesday. I love it because as a data guy, it gives me more data points to really sort of, it's a check on the polls, right? To see how reliable the polls have been, how strong this anti-Trump sentiment is from within the Republican Party. We get to test a lot of hypotheses as we go deeper into this, the primaries, but one thing we're not looking for tonight is any sort of indication of who the Republican nominee is. I think we know that already.
Well, we spoke with one of Nikki Haley's perhaps most vocal surrogates, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, yesterday after Nikki Haley had said in a few interviews that she would stay in the race if she were to be competitive. She didn't define what competitive means. He was a little reluctant to define what it means, though he did point to the fact that she's gotten north of 40% in states like his state, New Hampshire, north of 20% in others. And I wonder if those numbers aren't as meaningful really for Nikki Haley, because it doesn't change the outcome if she's not winning states in terms of the delicate math for the most part, but more influential when it comes to thinking about Donald Trump's strength as a candidate. Because if you have 20 to 40% of the Republican primary electorate choosing not you, what does that signal as you head into a really long general election battle with an incumbent?
Yeah, and one of the things that I looked at yesterday, I looked at the polling averages from 538 going into each of these early contests, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Michigan. And in each one of them, Nikki Haley overperformed the expectations. And in at least New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Michigan, significantly so, by 4, 5, 6 points. And so that, I think, is part of what's fueling her campaign, is that she gets a little bit of bounce every time she does it. Obviously, it's not helping her with picking up delegates. Super Tuesday is where the rubber is going to meet the road here, because if she doesn't pick up a significant amount of delegates tonight, it looks like Trump will be on track to clinch the nomination. He can't clinch it mathematically tonight, but he can by March 12th at the earliest. If she does well, she can push that date back to March 19th. Okay. But that's as much as she can do, really. But look, there's two reasons why candidates drop out. One is they run out of money, and the other is they want a job in the next administration. Nikki Haley continues to raise money, and it looks like she's foreclosed working for President Trump again. She was, of course, his UN ambassador in the first Trump administration. And so she, at this point, doesn't really have much motivation to drop out.
So maybe you've got that whole sort of halo effect as a candidate in waiting, insurgent candidate, something like that. Can she keep that on a low boil until 2028?
I think that will depend on how well former President Trump does in November. Yeah. If Joe Biden wins, despite all of the weaknesses we all know that Joe Biden has, then I think there's going to be some serious soul searching in the Republican Party. And Nikki Haley can come and say, look, I was the one who told you so. We need to rebuild this party as a new post-Trump party, and I'm the person to do that. If Trump wins, I don't know that I see quite that opportunity for her, because then a Trump win in November would fully cement the Trump takeover of the Republican Party, and that we will be more likely to see candidates in that MAGA mold going forward from Republicans. Wow.
All right. Gregory Cordy, as always, covering all things politics for us here at Bloomberg, going to join us on what is going to be a very long day this Super Tuesday. Gregory, thank you so much. And we want to turn now to another person who is following all of these races across the country very closely. David Paleologos is joining us now from Suffolk University, where he is the director of their Political Research Center. David, great to have you on the show. We were just hearing from Gregory about a number of states in which, sure, Nikki Haley did not win the Republican contest, but she did perform better than expected. If that were to show up anywhere tonight, where would you expect Nikki Haley to possibly outperform?
If it were to show up, she would probably do better in Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, Virginia, Those are the states that I would be looking at. The other states, less so. And maybe Utah, too.
You're up there in New England, David. You have a sense of Republican politics in a state like Massachusetts, or look north to Vermont or Maine. This tells us a lot when we're looking to New England states to gauge the strength of a Republican candidate, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when was the last time electoral votes were won by a Republican in any of those states? Maybe in one congressional district in Maine. And where you have independents who can vote, then you have a recipe for a possible upset. But even in our polling, which was over a month ago, so it's old. Trump was still prevailing in Massachusetts, and he's heavily favored to win. I wouldn't be surprised if he was around 1,000 by the end of the night, and Haley was in the 100 and something, 25 or 150 at best. So you're looking at, no matter how you slice it, you're looking at a 7, 8, 9-to-1 ratio of Trump delegates to Haley delegates.
Well, David, of course, Nikki Haley, when we've heard her campaigning recently, is she's committed to stay in the race through at least today's contest. She has said, look at the numbers that I'm polling. I understand, being an accountant, that 40% is not 50%, but 40% is not a small number. I'm paraphrasing words she spoke after South Carolina, her home state, where she was still resoundingly defeated by Trump. But when we think about that number she is referring to, those individuals that are picking her over Trump in this primary contest, where are they likely to go in a general election? Is it as problematic for a Trump general election candidacy as we might think?
We won't know that until the numbers settle, until after Nikki Haley, gets out of the race. It depends state to state. I mean, some states where Democrats were voting, they were never going to vote for Trump. They were just meddling. In the case of independents, left-leaning independents were probably not going to vote Republican. So you really have to isolate those subsets to pure independents or right-leaning independents. And the answer to your question is they could not vote. They could vote for Joe Biden, or more likely they could vote third party.
What are you going to be looking at then when we get through that first time zone, David? We've got the two most populous states involved here in Texas and California. That's where Donald Trump starts to put this in the bag, right?
Yeah, I mean, the more the night wears on, the worse it's going to be for Haley. And I've heard today recently that Haley has canceled a couple of appearances today, campaign stops, and she's settled back into South Carolina. That, to me, is a signal, and Joe, you know this better than anybody, that she's crafting a speech, whatever that speech says. They're working on, a speech to set herself up for whatever lies ahead in the future, whether it's 2028 or something else.
Are you surprised nothing's scheduled tonight? We understand she has not scheduled a speech, David. Does that mean if you hear of a late announcement, that might be significant?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of an announcement, but I've heard that she's pulled back today from some of her appearances. She is in South Carolina, and she is presumably working on her strategy. Either she's in talks with funders to find out whether or not what's the best case scenario for them to stay in financially or not. But obviously, she doesn't want to be distracted by doing a couple of events and making a poor career decision. So they're probably, sort of taking a deep breath. She's circling with her inner advisors to figure out what the best approach is.
Well, as you talk about potential other strategies she could pursue, I wonder if that could theoretically include a third party, which you were just referencing. Some Nikki Haley primary voters may end up voting for a third party come the general in November. We know No Labels has been interested in her. Nikki Haley seems to have suggested that she doesn't have interest in it in return. But No Labels has consistently said, David, that Super Tuesday after that is when they make the call whether they're going to run a unity ticket. Do you see a path for them?
For No Labels, I mean, I see a path for any third-party candidate to harness significant amounts of votes in swing states to turn the election. No Labels being one, RFK Jr. being one, Green Party being one, Libertarian, and Cornel West. And it really depends on what candidates, parties make what state ballots, because we know from 2016 and 2020 that the presence of third-party candidates directly impacted the outcome. I have to take Nikki Haley at her word that she's not going to pursue a No Labels option because she's a Republican. The moment she does that, then any future within the Republican infrastructure is pretty much gone. And I don't know that she wants to risk that at her age right now.
We're spending some time with David Paleologos, the Suffolk University Political Research Center director, on this Super Tuesday. A little later this hour, David, we're going to bring our conversation with Chris Sununu. He's obviously in a delicate situation here, talking about a candidate who may have some very difficult decisions to make. What is his political legacy here for backing Nikki Haley so passionately, speaking against Donald Trump openly, as a term-limited governor now going into the next chapter of his career?
I got to believe that people may say he comes off as a loser. I think he's one of the big winners of 2024 personally. And I don't know him. It's not, a personal thing. But I'm just looking at what he did in New Hampshire for her was amazing. To bring her literally within 11 points of Donald Trump in New Hampshire was an amazing feat coming off of Iowa. I mean, they identified neighborhood by neighborhood every independent that was anti-Trump and pulled them out. That kind of feat, forget Washington, D.C., and forget even her home state where she didn't even get 40%. In South Carolina, as I recall, she did better in New Hampshire. So what he did in New Hampshire, I take my hat off to him. I think he comes off as being loyal to her and to his own principles. And I think he sets himself up potentially for opportunities. It may not be in 2028, but it could be also.
All right, David Paleologos joining us from Suffolk University. Thank you so much, as always. It was such an interesting conversation, Joe, with Chris Sununu, the governor, last night. Essentially still defending Nikki Haley staunchly, saying that she is his candidate. He's still very much backing her, and yet still says that he will support Trump should he be the Republican nominee. Despite what did he say to us? Trump kicking dirt in the face of Republicans everywhere.
Yeah, we'll bring you a bit of that conversation coming up a little bit later on this hour of Balance of Power with the governor of New Hampshire. Be curious to hear what he's thinking tomorrow, Kailey. Yeah. First, our panel. Rick Davis is going to be with us coming up here in a special Super Tuesday panel with Brad Howard. Races to watch tonight. They'll lay out the roadmap, Kailey.
Yeah, it's not just presidential. There's a lot down ballot to consider as well. So we'll have more on that next. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We turn to our panel today. We've got a good one on this Super Tuesday. Rick Davis is with us, of course, Republican strategist, Bloomberg politics contributor, and Brad Howard from Corcoran Street Group, Democratic analyst, is here too. Gentlemen, great to have you with us on Super Tuesday. Rick, the down ballot races, I think where Kailey is going here, will likely be a lot more interesting than what we see on the presidential level. Is that all you need to know going into this Super Tuesday?
Yeah, I mean, you actually don't know what the outcome's going to be on these down ballot races. We know what the outcome's going to be in the presidential primary. So there at least is some mystique involved in the down ballot.
All right. So, Brad, if you could pick a down ballot contest, which one is going to be the most interesting, perhaps the most telling of the general feeling going into November? As we know, there's also some primaries in which you have a more MAGA-oriented Trump-backed candidate against more establishment candidates. What's going to be the tell?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at Alabama 1 right there. You've got it's the first member-on-member primary this cycle because of redistricting. There's a new seat there. I'm also watching who emerges out of that new seat because that will be a relatively competitive general election, that new Alabama seat. So we'll see who emerges on the Democratic side there to see who's going to take on whoever the Republicans nominate. But in that Alabama 1 seat, you've got Jerry Carl versus Barry Moore, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Freedom Caucus on one side, Chamber of Commerce, traditional Republicans on the other. That'll be a fascinating one to watch for sure.
That new seat you mentioned is important. At least 11 candidates fighting for this newly drawn district, Rick Davis. You know Alabama politics pretty well. This is a seat that would have been won easily by Joe Biden in 2020 by more than 10 points, it appears. Who are you looking at?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, anytime you've got that many people running in a new district, it's just anybody's guess. I think that the one I'm watching is in Texas. Sheila Jackson Lee, her opponent Amanda Edwards. They know each other really well. They've worked together. Sheila Jackson ran for mayor and did really poorly and has made her vulnerable. Yep. And I think she could be one of the highest profile incumbents going down.
All right, so clearly a lot to watch outside of the presidential contest tonight. But, of course, the presidential contest, as we know, gentlemen, is going to be what's making most of the headlines. And on that note, I want to point to a note that came into my inbox from Terry Haynes over at Pangea Policy, someone we speak to frequently here on Bloomberg TV and radio, who writes that Trump has the same four problems after Super Tuesday that he had before it. Rick, he says, an enthusiastic base that hasn't grown since 2020, a split Republican Party that's now all but embedded, independents aren't for him, and Trump encourages all of it. Do you agree with that assessment, Rick?
Yeah, that sounds pretty realistic. I mean, Terry's a very smart guy, and I wouldn't doubt him on that. But those elements are all there and makes it, a very interesting contest.
Be very curious to hear about Joe Biden because we're not talking about him too much today. Brad, there's a storyline in Minnesota, of course, about a potential protest vote. But he's in primary contests across the country, just like Donald Trump is. Should he be speaking tonight? He could deliver some sort of victory address and warm up for the State of the Union, no?
I mean, if he would like to, I think if I'm his prep team, I've got his head in the State of the Union, which is much more consequential. As we all know, the number of live events that Americans all kind of tune in to watch has dramatically declined.
Sure.
But as we saw, there's an appetite for it. We saw the Super Bowl highest ratings ever. I think this may be one of the highest ratings ever for a State of the Union because so much is at risk for the president. He's got complex situations over abroad. He's got a hyper-partisan environment here at home. There's a new speaker that's going to stand behind him. So there's a lot at stake here for the president. He's got to both shore up his base, show strength abroad, and lay out an agenda for another term. And so he's got to keep his head there where it matters. And one quick thing on the Democratic base on the protest votes here. When you looked at Michigan,
sure.
Yeah, there were 13 that voted for non-committed. Back in 2012, Obama, 11% voted non-committed in Michigan. And of course, Obama went on to win not only Michigan, but the presidency. So let's keep things in historical perspective.
Yeah, but of course, we're talking about percentage of the overall vote, and the actual numbers were a little bit bigger in Biden's case this time around. And also, while we're talking about that uncommitted vote in Michigan and how it could translate elsewhere, it wasn't just in places like Dearborn, concentrated with, heavily Muslim and Arab American populations. It was also Ann Arbor and East Lansing. I keep coming back to this point. Michigan State, the University of Michigan. Brad, does he still have a problem with young people? And what does that mean for him in a general election contest?
Look, young voters are tricky. You've got they are fairly new to the electorate. They're not They really don't care what you've done previously. They want to know what you're going to do moving forward. They are idealistic. They are energized. You've got to have them not only vote for you, but you got to have, they're the ground troops that are out there knocking on doors and getting you votes. So they're a tricky bunch. And, overall, this is the time when our base likes to vent its frustration, as they should, right? By nature of being a progressive, you're never happy. You're never satisfied with the status quo. You're always wanting more, bigger, and bolder. And so by nature, there's some unrest always with a Democratic president this time in the cycle. My hope is that by November, that the Biden campaign is really taking the youth vote seriously, is really find ways to engage, to not only persuade them and consolidate them, but also utilize their passions and energy to help win in November.
It is interesting. Joe Biden's just getting back to the White House today from Camp David. This is
long weekend.
All about the State of the Union. Rick, is that smart business? It's not worth it to put him out in front of people tonight. Focus on Thursday.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, this is the latest State of the Union I think I can ever recall. And frankly, the speaker's gotten a lot of criticism from his caucus by giving Joe Biden this incredible backstop to Super Tuesday here. Their plan was to have Donald Trump basically proclaim the presumptive nominee tonight. And now they're going to let Biden steal the show with the State of the Union a day later. So I think that this is exactly what Brad said. I think this is the whole game for him is State of the Union. He's going to have tens of millions of people watching this speech. Could be the most consequential speech of this term, and certainly the most consequential speech that he's going to give between now and the convention. And so this one, he's got to get right. And realizing that prep is what prep is, I never expected him to be bouncing around Super Tuesday states 2 days before State of the Union.
Well, Rick, as you talk about maybe the speaker having given Biden something of a gift to be able to give an address like this right on the heels of Super Tuesday, could he also take something away from the president if the House actually passes this package of funding bills to avert a shutdown come Friday? Does Biden lose a talking point over congressional dysfunction?
Well, they're only going to get 6 of the 12 passed by then.
Fair enough.
And so it's not like you've got to really scramble to find dysfunction in the House Republicans. And I think that's one thing I'm really looking for is how much he uses this B-team speaker and House dysfunction in his State of the Union. I think it's unavoidable. He has got to point out the biggest limitation to progress in his agenda has been this crew in the House.
Great panel on Super Tuesday. Thanks to both of you, Rick Davis and Brad Howard. We'll be back with Rick a little bit later on this evening, and I want to remind everybody that we have special coverage coming up. Kailey starts 8 p.m. Eastern time on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube here on Bloomberg Radio and Television starting at 9 p.m. And we'll be going pretty late tonight as we follow through 6 time zones, if my count is correct.
I believe that is correct.
Interesting escapade.
We will be on air until 11 p.m.
That's right.
Washington time, hence why we are caffeinating throughout the day today.
Always.
But of course, we could get calls potentially as early as the 7 o'clock hour, Joe, because that's when polls are going to close in Vermont and Virginia, right? And
exactly.
If history is a guide, we've been getting race calls on the Republican side within, a minute?
01. It'll be 7:01. Most likely. And at 8:01, we'll have another round for you. So when you join us this evening, we'll be starting with breaking news. It might feel predictable, but we, of course, like to wait until the votes are counted.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Alongside Kailey Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu in the nation's capital. As we look, Kailey, across the country, 15 states holding Republican contests. 11 of them are open to more than just registered Republicans. Yeah. And that's been the narrative so far until now by the Nikki Haley campaign. These are the types of states that she could potentially outperform in. And we spent some time with her chief surrogate, the governor of New Hampshire.
Yeah, Chris Sununu did join us yesterday evening on the eve of Super Tuesday. And we talked to him about the math because, Joe, you're absolutely right. There are a number of states in which independently minded voters could work in her favor. But the problem is only 2 states are not winner take all. Right. So whoever gets more than 50% of the vote, which if polling is correct, looks very likely to be Donald Trump, gets all the delegates. Therefore, the math becomes really difficult if she's trying to secure the nomination. And we posed that question to Governor Sununu. If it's not actually about getting the number of delegates to secure the nomination, if that's not mathematically possible, why is Haley staying in this race? Here's his response.
The reason to stay in the race is to collect enough delegates to be president. That's Nikki's mission. That's it. She's not here to make a point. She's not putting herself on the line, spending all this energy, all this exhaustion away from her family, being out there every single day tirelessly, for anything other than being president and getting this country back on track. And that's exactly what you want to see. So, no, it's not about some of these other candidates who get in just to try to make a point or sell a book or whatever the heck it is. Nikki is about focusing on this country and what she can bring to the table, not just as, from the country's perspective, but as a Republican. I love the fact that she doesn't just win, she wins handily against Joe Biden. She brings senators and new House members and governorships all with her. She wins up and down the ballot. Trump cannot do that.
Ambassador Haley signaled yesterday she might not endorse Donald Trump in an interview on Meet the Press, that she no longer sees herself bound to a pledge to an RNC that she sees changing here. Of course, it is changing as we speak, Governor. Do you support that decision? Do you feel the same way?
Well, she didn't say she wouldn't. She's definitely not going to. So she didn't say that. They, when the press is asking you as a candidate if you're going to support the person you're running against, it's a ridiculous question, right? To say, oh yeah, by the way, I'll support the person I'm running against.
I'm trying to be careful. She signaled that she might not. I'm trying to be fair here, Governor. She signaled she might not.
Look, yeah, sure, yeah. She said she might not. And again, it's a ridiculous question also because is Trump? Has he committed to supporting the Republican nominee if it's not him?
I think you know the answer to that. Of course he hasn't.
Yeah, of course. So it's this faux outrage. I can't believe that she won't answer the question or be clear about it when Trump has gotten away with completely, kicking dirt in the face of the Republican Party across this country, kind of making his own rules as he goes, but he gets away with it. So, look, at the end of the day, I mean, Nikki will decide what Nikki's going to do. Regardless of who the nominee is, you're going to see a lot of folks understand that Joe Biden is not the future of America, right? I mean, that's a real problem for a whole variety of reasons. We could do an hour on a show about why that's a problem. Yeah. There's a reason why Trump, actually is neck and neck with Biden. The problem is, again, it's not just about who wins the presidency. It's about who brings the rest of the party over the line. And I keep going back to that, but it's so important. We're tired of, as Republicans, we are tired of losing. And we lost in 20. We lost in 22. We lost with Trump as the standard bearer and kind of the front end and the messenger of the party, his type of candidates, his style. That is complete losing for the Republican Party. So he could snake by, I guess, but Nikki would win it in droves. At the end of the day, I thought it was kind of funny that they would even ask her the question because she's still very much in this race. She's still fighting hard a couple days from Super Tuesday, and all she's trying to do is get more voters out. Every new voter that comes out that typically might not vote in a primary that comes out on Super Tuesday is likely a Nikki Haley voter. So getting the vote out, not just kind of to push back against this concerted base that Trump has, and that's understandable given that he's an incumbent president. But every new voter she can drive out is another bit of opportunity, and that's all you're thinking about as a candidate. How do you win?
Well, what about what you're thinking about as a surrogate? Because, Governor, you've been asked the question. In fact, Joe and I have asked it of you when we were up in New Hampshire in January, this idea that you would support Trump should he be the Republican nominee as an alternative to Joe Biden. As you just described him as someone kicking dirt in the face of Republicans, I believe there is a very real chance he could be convicted of a felony in the not so distant future. Is there anything that would change your mind on that?
Right now, no. Look, I want a strong ticket, and my focus is going to be. I'm not going to be governor. I've done my 4 terms here. I'm deciding to step down. My focus is always going to be, in New Hampshire, and I'm just kind of speaking where my position as a governor. I think you can translate it to 49 other states. Party leaders and folks that are elected are going to focus really hard on their states. The problem with Trump is that he's not going to be able to raise money because he's already spent $60 million on his legal fees. Probably another $50 million to go. His people have now co-opted and are now running the RNC. So, again, who's going to give the RNC money knowing that a lot of that money might just go to pay off his legal fees? It's going to put a lot of pressure on candidates to raise money into their own PACs, into their own organizations, where typically they might have relied on the RNC for help. I just don't see that as actually being there. So, look, I'm going to support the Republican Party, the Republican ticket as strong as I can. I'm a conservative. I believe in those ideals. I'm very optimistic about the Republican Party. Whether Trump's there or not, there's still a lot of opportunity to get things right in this country. country, to get back to believing that the individual comes first, not a bunch of liberal elitists in Washington that are standing on the shoulders of American families that built this country, defend this country, but are being told how to live their lives. People are absolutely sick and tired of it. So the Republican Party has a huge opportunity to have candidates, not just who's running for president, but have candidates up and down the ballot that connect with that and say, we're going to actively make a change. We're not just going to go and raise more money, try to get ourselves reelected, but we're going to be an active part of a positive process that gets this country back on track.
The governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, speaking with us yesterday, and wanted to make sure that you heard that conversation here on Bloomberg as Nikki Haley stares down the barrel of 15 more contests this evening, and it's difficult to tell where she might go from here. Kailey, NBC News is reporting. Of course, we know she's back in the Charleston area. The staff at the headquarters in good spirits today. The songs of choice are "Sisters Are Doing It for Themselves" and "Started from the Bottom."
Now we're here is the line that typically
you'd be ready for that.
typically follows. But it brings me back to New Hampshire, Joe. Remember, we were all set to go. We were there on the ground. We were going to go to a Ron DeSantis event one afternoon. And it turned out he wasn't even in the state of New Hampshire. He was in Florida and then dropped his speech that he was leaving the race. And of course, that is what we're on watch for. There is no signal directly from Nikki Haley that she'd be leaving the race after these contests, but she hasn't signaled the same commitment to staying in past these 15 states.
Yes, that's true.
As she had to just getting to today.
As the Trump campaign targets March 12th or 19th for presumptive status, when he would mathematically have this in the bag, it still could be mathematically impossible for her to become the nominee tomorrow. And the candidate in waiting idea is starting to wear a little bit thin as Donald Trump scores additional legal victories here. And it looks like we may not have a Jack Smith trial even before this election.
Yeah, you have to get an immunity decision from the Supreme Court first. Of course, the Supreme Court already yesterday did weigh in on another Trump-related matter that factors in today because he's on the ballot in Colorado, despite the Supreme Court there initially saying because of the 14th Amendment he could not be. So voters there and across 14 other states could have the chance to vote for him. And of course, we'll continue to have that covered for you right here on Bloomberg.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.